Welcome to the Mommy Matters podcast, where Mommy Matters is a double entendre that states and declares that mommies matter, where we have conversations surrounding mommy matters, from conception to pregnancy to postpartum, mother and father wounds, dating, mindfulness and self-care, spirituality, parenting, discipline, legislation, money, and so much more. It is my hope and my prayer that the information that you gather here serves as a blueprint for generational and individual ascension. Enjoy. Thank you for joining us for this month's episode of the Mommy Matters podcast, where we will be discussing mothering and grief. I think this is an interesting and unique topic for us to discuss, something that we all experience. Grief is experienced in so many different ways. And I have a wonderful guest who specializes in this conversation around grief and mothering. Based on her own experiences as well as observations. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with her. As you know, I'm Cecile, the host. You hear me every month. But we have Julia Mallory, who is a writer, teaching artist, and cultural worker. She is a 6-time author, including 2 children's books. Her latest book, Survivor's Guilt, is a multi-genre meditation on generational grief. In addition, she is the founder of the creative literary arts brand, Black Mermaids, and she serves as the senior poetry editor for Raising Mothers and hosts the Stop Shrinking Social Cast. You can find her on Instagram. You'll also see that in the description of the podcast, how you can find her website, etc. So we'll jump right into just sort of unpacking some of the things that you do. Julia, hi.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It is such a pleasure to have you. And we connected. I always connect with people via social media really well. And I think that one of us friended the other, and then we got to a conversation in, and here we are. I love the flowingness of that, right? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your work. You are a 6-time author, including 2 children's books. So your latest book is about survivor's guilt.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. Survivor's Guilt, which is multi-genre and a meditation on generational grief. So we like to talk about generational wellness here. Mm-hmm. What is generational grief to you?
Generational grief to me, it can have multiple meanings, but I think in this context, I am looking at it from a very personal perspective in terms of being a child loss survivor. My oldest son, Julian, was a victim of gun violence 4 years ago, and connecting that across space and time to other instances of child loss in my family. And initially, so Survivor's Guilt was originally published in November 2019. And, at the time, obviously none of us knew that we were just a few short months later would be in the thick of a worldwide pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up re-releasing the book of April 2021 because I felt like I didn't really get a chance to, I think, one, have all the conversations I wanted to have with folks around grief, but then it just felt like, oh my goodness, like I want to update this book. I want to say a few more things to try and connect to the reality of what is happening right now. And so for me, generational grief is, like I said, it is very, in this case, very familial specific, but then also I'm linking it to kind of an overall idea of Black grief throughout the ages, and how there's a certain type of specific experience that Black people have around grief in the US. And so to me, I know you talk a lot about your work is dealing with a lot about generational wellness. And I believe that part of that wellness is us being in connection and conversation with loss. If we don't tend to kind of the wounds that happen as a result of a lot of times premature Black death, to be quite frank, I think that is part of our overall ability to be free. So to me, that's what generational grief means.
Yes, so many things came to my mind as you were speaking. The last thing that came to my mind was when talking about Black grief, that the what Emmett Till's mother did, in the what was that, the 60s, 50s, with putting her child on display, for the world to see what the reality of Black people's plight in America in terms of the violence and the terrorization and the result of that. Is what just came to my mind when it comes to a national level and how we see that even during the pandemic, and what happened with George Floyd, and the many instances honestly throughout history where the world has gotten to see what has happened or what is happening in this country now. I'm also thinking about on a micro level of the families dealing with that, and whether or not that's something that is experienced in the family through generations, right? So I actually learned about Emmett Till that his father actually also lost his life around a very similar situation, right?
Yes.
That's a historical fact that we don't know. That's not part of the story oftentimes for a lot of reasons. But that is a historical fact. And I find that to be interesting. And we know we may talk about, I wish that we would talk about more like our health histories, with our families. Did we experience certain things? I had a conversation with a woman recently who said that she didn't know that her grandmother also had womb issues and at some point had to have hysterectomy, all of these things really is a part of, being well, because now we can deal with what it is that's underlying those things, perhaps if we can, and really connect ancestrally, because that's who we are. We're ancestral people. And so, part of honoring our ancestors is living well, I believe. Right. So one of the questions that popped in my mind was, is this something, what happened with your eldest son, something that happened in your family, a similar thing as well that you're aware of anyway? And what are some ways that you have found people are able to broach conversations and come to a point of trying to heal this and move through that grief?
So I can't necessarily say, and I think also just before I even get started in replying to you, a couple of things. It is interesting, even as you started speaking, right? You already were kind of getting into a very vast web of, all these multiple connections that exist for us. And I think that is that illustrates sometimes the complexity of even trying to locate where to start and where to begin these conversations. And you mentioned Emmett Till, and I think that even that, in a sense, when we talk about parenting and parenthood and mothering, and thinking about Mamie Till's exceptionally bold example, and I believe just this past week was Mamie Till's would have been her 100th birthday.
Okay.
And my I believe because even I was just thinking about this recently, because thinking about just the fear that Black parents have a lot of times around their children. And I believe my own father was born 4 months before Emmett Till was killed. And I thought about that, like, even just like, how did, how do people react, when you're bringing children into this world and you find out about this excruciatingly cruel thing that happened, and just adding more fear on top of the reality of parenting. So, there's so much, there's so much there. But the specific question that you asked me was, was there an exact example of something that would happen to my son? Not that I can necessarily find in my family history, but the one thing, in the updated version of Survivor's Guilt, I do tell this story, a very collapsed version or condensed version of my family's history. So my paternal side of the family is originally from Georgia. And so my great great grandmother, she, I talk about, I utilize or talk about the child loss, or just the grief that she experienced. Um, she lost her husband, um, a pregnancy at 6 months, and a child that was about the age of 3, all within a year's time. And so, and I'm piecing this together as best I can, based off of the access to the records that I have, and some narrative family history. But it looks as if, let's say, they left Georgia during that first wave of the Great Migration. And so to me, it looks as if, okay, let's say maybe her husband passed and then they migrated. She was pregnant at the time. And then her, I'm imagining, I believe that her 3-year-old child possibly had passed first and then she lost the pregnancy. So I don't, know all the circumstances surrounding all of that. But I think about, my father passed when I was 13. So I'm, my grandmother was also a child loss survivor, my grandmother's only child, as also, that part we don't have in common. But so in the story in Survivor's Guilt, one of the new essays, I'm kind of telling that story, across space and time, about child loss also in varying stages, as well. So I can't necessarily say I know there's a specific instance of gun violence that my family experienced in the similar way, but there's absolutely this story of child loss, and I'm trying to, in Survivor's Guilt, there's a specific way in which I'm also linking those histories across space and time, and just and I think the thing, when we talk about, you even said like, oh, we don't always know our family histories and things like that. A health history, how do we start those conversations? I think, someone in my community had posted on Facebook that they feel so bad because they only know like up until like one grandmother or something. And I realized, I'm like, oh, some of it is like, we just really have to ask. Some people just don't think, they live their life and they're not really thinking that you want to know these stories. They don't think they're important, or they don't think they're significant. And I found out so much, even like a year ago, just even asking my mom and my aunt questions. And it's so funny because they're both the oldest, but even their memories are very different. what they
Mm.
remember, what's important to them, their vantage point. And even my aunt, she's the oldest, she's very much a very like intuitive person, and a person that messages come to in dreams. And so just even her perspective of how she processes information was so radically different than what my mom remembers or cares to remember or cares to talk about, So not
Mhm.
everyone is always, I even found that too when we're having these conversations. Some people enjoy talking about the past. Some people like, child, that's the past, right? And so it's like, how do we also get each other to a point of safety and care to where
Mhm.
people even feel comfortable time traveling in that way?
Mhm.
Because I had to even realize, I'm like, wow, just recently, being very intentional about a certain type of grief work and memory work, I was able to recently like tap back into memories like in a very specific way that I hadn't before,
Mhm.
like in the present, feel a certain type of safety that it was like, oh, I feel okay now to go back to those places.
Yeah.
Whereas before, it might have felt as an avoidance because maybe I didn't feel safe then, or maybe I don't even feel safe revisiting the past. So I think it can be very complicated um, for us to have those conversations. So I think an encouraging way is like, hey, not don't have the conversations because they're complicated or difficult, but understanding those conditions and trying to like figure out like how do you prepare,
Mhm.
right? How do you respect those boundaries? Um, and how do you illustrate even the power and the value and the beauty of perhaps knowing versus not knowing? So
Mhm.
I would encourage folks that, want to have those conversations. Also, just be mindful of that too, right? Like we don't want to replicate the same models of harm that we see when people are trying to study us, right? So we want to be very mindful when we're talking to our people too, that we come through with the right type of love, concern, and even preparation.
That's a very powerful point and something that I learned from my
Mhm.
own trying to excavate family, just really just trying to get to know better my maternal line and specifically my paternal line as well. I'll ask them questions. But my grandmothers, I'm very blessed to still have both of my
Such
grandmothers.
a blessing. Such a blessing.
And so, on reflecting on that, I was like, let me try to have conversations with them about their lives growing up. They grew up in Jamaica, both of them,
Mm.
and so that's a different life. They immigrated here. So that's a different, you know what I'm saying? Like there's so
Mhm.
much there, that I want to know. My paternal grandmother, she told me what she could remember. And, she told me she was free with it. My maternal grandmother, on the other hand, was very guarded. She was like, I don't remember. I'm not interested.
No, thank you.
Yeah. And, I wasn't offended by that because I realized that, she most likely experienced a lot of, traumatizing things, what we call traumatizing things at this point that she may have forgotten or
Mhm.
that she doesn't want to remember for so many reasons. Um, and as you were talking, I started to think about, well, man, the impact that trauma has on your ability to tell a story, like not just like literally physiologically, because we know that when we tell certain stories, we get certain feelings. If it's a good story, we get tingly, we feel good, when we tell not so nice stories, how do we feel? You know?
Right. And even how forgetting is even sometimes the brain's, defense mechanism,
Mhm.
right? It's also a safety measure for some of us, right? So, um, folks spent folks spent 60 years, 70 years forgetting something, and here you come talking about some, can't you just find it for me? It might take a little bit of time. And I think I've also, because I've been also really thinking a lot about the idea of like the archive lately and been reading different things. And um I just read an article recently that because they were talking about, I believe there was a large fire, I want to say in South Africa, and a lot of like historical, like the archive, like a major library and source of information was destroyed.
Wow.
And so this article is talking about like, hey, what does it mean to, like, we could, like, how do we still build our lives and our stories and our histories when we don't have physical reminders or documents to do that, right? And I think about, the enslaved Africans and Black folks experience in this country in particular, and how we, just even doing that genealogical work is filled with so much grief, because you're trying to locate people who have been basically disappeared or weren't even considered significant enough to record, or record with respect and dignity, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about that too, and just saying, how can we still find ways to cultivate those memories, even if it's not always a linear, like, oh, this happened in 1934, or this, this is a picture of the thing. And even sometimes when, like, maybe our grandmothers don't want to remember those very difficult and complex and painful memories, is it enough to just be like, oh, grandmother, what was your favorite song? Like, what song did you like?
Yeah.
What type of snacks did you like to eat as a child?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, sometimes it doesn't have to always be this, like,
heavy.
Tell me every single excruciating detail, or, sometimes it could just be finding, I think for me, it's like I want to have something to hold on to, right? Even if it ain't the whole history, I just want to have something to hold on to that gives me a memory that I can always associate with that person, right? And so sometimes it can just be that. Sometimes it doesn't have to be this, you may not be able to build a book out of just those stories, sometimes, or maybe you can, because I do think there is also a process of, sometimes you start with what you have, right? You start with what you have, and you never know where that piece of information or that detail will lead you. You don't know what else is connected to in the universe. So there's more than one way about, going about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you set the intention to know, things will show up to facilitate that.
Absolutely.
And I agree with you with the, because I say it all the time when I used to coach women around their mother wounds. I would say, every conversation you don't have to come at every conversation with, it's sort of like that conversation where you text somebody, we need to talk. And now they're anticipating something like heavy,
Right.
Like, oh my God, what they want to talk about now,
Right.
Sometimes you can just come at it real light, like, as you said, what's your favorite food? What do you like about that favorite food? Is it because it's crunchy, or you know what I'm saying? Like, what?
Like, I found out, like, for example, so my mother does not really eat sweets. I mean, I'm saying really, like, I mean, she doesn't, for the most part. She loves fruit
her
and things
discipline.
like that.
I need her life.
She doesn't really eat desserts and things like that. And I found that out because I was asking her, because I remember, so I never met my mom's mom. She died before I was born. And but I have very vivid memories of my mom's aunt, who was her dad's sister, who was a phenomenal cook. Okay. So I was like, hey, did Emma teach y'all how to cook? And she was like, oh, my mom was a cook. Her mom was a good cook too. And I was like, oh, okay. I did not know that. And she said, yeah. And she also, she used to make the best pies and cakes and things like that. And so, finding out in that conversation with my mom, like, that's pretty much why she stopped eating sweets, because her mother was the one who used to make the sweets, and just, I guess,
Stop making it. It was like, no, I don't.
Yeah, I guess when she passed, it was like, I don't, know if it was an automatic, like, I can't touch it type of thing, but just, or her appetite for it went away when her mother passed. So I was like, oh wow, like, something that specific. It was like I never knew that. and it's not even a question that you even really know how to ask. I was asking more so just trying to figure out, what's my role as a recipe keeper, or like how will we continue, because my mom and my aunt are phenomenal cooks, and just like whoo, like somebody, ain't a lot of people like their children, a lot of them ain't cooking, and so I'm just like, I do cook, and I'm like, wow, like I don't know, I need to be ready, like we gotta we can't be losing recipes,
Yeah.
so I didn't even, and that revelation like shocked me.
Mhm. On a similar note, I discovered that my maternal great grandmother used to be a restaurateur and baked like beef patties herself, because I would always try to bake stuff. And one day, my grand aunt, her daughter, would be like, "Yeah, your grandmother, she used to own this and she used to bake that and this and that." In my family, she can be pretty intentional. The other side of this conversation is being intentional about telling stories, right?
Mhm.
And just telling stories. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is what happened when I was younger, and this is what I learned. I think that we are, the griots were central parts of societies, and still are in a lot of ways in a lot of African societies. And indigenous societies, period, and so it's like, how do we revive that? Because I think part of the intentionality of systemic breakdown is trying to erase people's stories and cultures. And so how do we revive the telling of it from our own perspective, so that we're not, the narrative isn't from someone else's view and gaze.
Mhm.
And if you do still have, older, whoever the oldest person is in your family, do you engage in conversation with them? Do you listen to what they have to say? Do you try to understand perspective, or, you know what I'm saying? Just sit and talk with them, because they are definitely a repository of, information that you wouldn't know. Like, they lived through things, that you can read it in a book. But what if you ask your grandmother, like, do you remember when this and that happened?
Right.
I can get personal account of, my grandmother's living through Hurricane Gilbert in Jamaica, which is one of the worst hurricanes that hit Jamaica, in the 1980s. I can get
Mm.
an account of that because they were there, whereas reading it in a book, you're going to get a very watered down version, so you can more deeply understand. So I think being intentional about, as a mother, I know I tell my daughter stories about things that happen in my child, especially when she does something or says something that clicks a memory. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh my goodness, I remember when I was in sixth grade and this and that and that and this, you know. Yeah, because they need to know that they're on a continuum, right? They're not recreating everything. You're on
Right. We didn't just fall out of the sky, right? We're already connected to a vast constellation of possibilities and realities. And so I think that is something that I think for us is always, especially as this like this place, sometimes Black folks just really trying to, I think there's also grief in that, just trying to locate the source of connection.
yes.
Um,
Absolutely.
when our stories sometimes is that of displacement. So
Absolutely. That is
yeah.
definitely. And talking about, there's two things that just came to my mind. So, we typically hear the stages of grief, right? There's
Mhm.
the 5 stages of grief.
Mhm.
Have denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Mhm.
Recently read in an article where, that theory, because everything comes from a theory, right?
Mhm.
So this is the theory that, someone wrote in the 19, I don't know, whatever, 80s or whatever, 60s. And that's what people have gone off. I read an article recently where it said that, that's not accurate. People go through, more or less depending on various things,
Mhm.
relationship with the person, their level of personal development, all of these things affect and impact grief. The other thing is too, is that we can grieve so many things, right? So over this pandemic, losing family members, loved ones, or just in life, losing family members and loved ones, but we can also grieve over the loss of a sense of self. We can grieve over, losing a job. We can grieve over losing what we thought was a part of our identity that we're now letting go. We can grieve, not being able to have a certain thing that we thought that we wanted. Like there's so many things that we can grieve, and we're in a constant state of grief is what I've come to realize, just perhaps different stages for different things. So we're constantly holding that in some way, shape, or form. So I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that and what your perspective may be.
Yes. So my thoughts on so to talk just very quickly about the stages of grief model. That model was popularized by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was doing research with folks who were facing their own mortality, so people who were at end of life.
Okay.
And I believe also very much through the lens of a social worker. Those results were originally published in her book on death and dying in 1969. And I think that, to be fair to Dr. Kubler-Ross, she later said, like, I'm not sure I meant for the stages to be like taken as like a linear, process. And then also, I think, also saying that, grief is not just about death related loss. So eventually, talking to folks who not just are only end of life, but their family members and things like, and other discussions. So couple of things from my own experience and working with folks who are grieving. Okay. I think that because it is like a term that is rooted, kind of in emotional health or well-being and psychology, and social work, I think that there are maybe some phrasing and words that maybe people ordinarily may not use, but then like looking at the model, sometimes it gives people language around their feelings, right?
Yeah.
About how they feel.
Definitely.
So sometimes it could be useful in that way. What I've also experienced is people saying, when I've had grief workshops, what I've also experienced is people saying, oh my goodness, I'm so glad to know that it's not linear. I'm so glad to hear that it is not just like a 1-2, like sequential also, because people can often feel bad if their grief doesn't mirror what they see discussed in the stage model. Right. So people might feel like, oh my goodness, it's stage, it's 6 years and I'm still on stage 3. Right. So they might feel like they're not doing grief right. But what I always try to tell people too is that, like, hey, it's possible that you will obviously experience some of these, that you may experience none of these, and that you may, if you're like me, I've had days where I experience all of the stages, in a matter of a morning. Right. So I think frameworks are cool. Right. I think sometimes frameworks can be cool because they give us different ways to look at things and explore them, but they're not the end all be all. Right. And so I think, to me, when we have additional conversations about grief, we can say that to one another. We can say, okay, girl, your grief may not look like mine. That doesn't make it less valid. Correct. Right. Because I think we also are very much obsessed with this idea of just healed, as opposed to healing not being a one-time event. And that is just a thing that, like, oh, I've overcome that. And so there are some things, I always try to liken it to, like, even like this kind of like physical healing, that sometimes when something might, may no longer need a medical intervention, right? But there's still a reminder there that the thing happen. So, I might have a cut. Okay, it's no longer bleeding. There's nothing else. There's no, like I said, no medical intervention is no longer needed for it. But the scar is still there, right? The reminder is still there. You might break a bone. Okay, there's nothing else that we can do to change that it happened, but it is healed, but there might still be some type of ache or pain that might revisit you every so often, right? What do some of us say, like, oh, I know it's going to rain because my knee's acting up or something
Yeah.
like that. It doesn't mean that we're not healed. It's just that we're like humans and not robots. Like, we can't erase our memories. We can't, our bodies are these very much intricate,
Intuitive,
complex,
intelligent. Yeah. Mhm.
web of, and constellation is a word that is hitting me today. So I'm gonna be saying that a lot, you know, that are holding so much,
Mhm.
right? So I say all that to say, as far as like the stages model, people have also, again, and when we talk about research and we talk about studies and we talk about, when you do a research study, right, we're supposed to have a certain type of sample because whatever you want it to be, you want it to be inclusive. Dr. Kubler-Ross's model, like, who were the type of people that she talked to,
Exactly.
right? um Beyond being beyond these folks being connected because they were facing their own mortality, were they very white? Were they very middle class or upper middle class or wealthy? Were they very geographically concentrated and specific? There are so many things I would say, like, hey, this model may not be representative of us across the board. And then another thing that I've also found too, in discussing the model with folks, when we talk about also being non-white, and again with Black grief, um, being a personal and also a very communal experience, even when we're having conversations around grief, the part that gets very complex is that if people are experiencing very persistent and premature and pervasive grief, models are also, I think this model is also less helpful for that, because before you even get over the other situation that happened, here come three more. Right. And so for that, in that instance, processing, I think, also your grief through a particular framework that looks at it almost like, again, whether it was intended to be sequential or linear or not, it's probably going to feel less useful, right? So I think I'm always big on just telling people, like, get in touch with your own grief, right? Be honest about your feelings. That'll help you to, I think, identify just even the patterns or what triggers it, or we can't always control our grief or when it decides to make an appearance. But for me personally, paying attention to it, being in conversation with it, connecting it to things around me and to other people, it really helps me to understand those patterns. Also, just what I need to do to care and nurture myself as well.
Yep.
And then calling in support and calling in help. Because I think what also happens a lot of times when we are avoiding our grief, right? When we don't make time for it, can't locate the point of it, all of those things, it it's going to find a way to get the attention that it wants, right? It's not like, grief is not just going to leave us alone because we leaving it alone. It's going to find a way to get heard, seen, felt. So I try to look at it as like, grief is like, hey, I'm sorry we had to meet like this. You know what I mean? Like, unfortunately, this is just kind of, I'm here to kind of help you mark time. I'm here to help you remember these people. I'm here to help you remember your connection to yourself and to other folks around you. And in that way, because the loss is already the reality, right? The loss has already happened. The only thing we can do, I think, is try to obviously navigate what that looks like. And this hasn't even gotten into just talking about also how grief is not just brought on by death-related laws, right? And a pandemic, I think for so many of us is illustrating that point, that we are having to acknowledge how much we were connected to certain ways of living, how much we were connected to certain ways of existing in the world. Even just our attachment to shit that like maybe we didn't even really want those things, but we're just so used to it. So we're just so tapped into it, you know. And even like, and I think that's sometimes the hardest like loss, right? Is being able to be like, yo, I didn't even want this for myself. And yet I'm still so attached to it because it's become a part of my identity. And so there is so many ways in which grief presents. Like grief is probably, it's super normal. I think there's a way in which we've exceptionalized it, because I think even though we're talking about generational wellness, we are in a system that quite frankly thrives off of us being unwell, right? It's expensive to be unwell.
That part.
Right? It's expensive to be unwell. We know that we are also going to do a lot of things to avoid acknowledging how unwell we are. And there are systems that absolutely benefit from all of those things as being maladjusted, that it wouldn't even stand a chance. These systems wouldn't even have a chance to thrive. And if we were able to really tend to ourselves and care for ourselves at the level that we deserve. So I always say that because I think there's a lot of shame in these conversations, right? Obviously, when we're talking to our elders and our ancestors and trying to get those stories and things, and a lot of the trauma is also related to shame. And so I try to also just have these conversations because we feel so bad sometimes. Like we feel bad for feeling bad, right? And so because we have these, what do we say a lot of times? Like, oh, I'm grateful because somebody else somewhere is doing worse off than me.
No,
I mean, that's cool. That ain't no cure for pain.
Right.
That didn't do nothing to help you tap into what's really on you.
Exactly.
So I try to also just always be mindful of like, it's okay. It's okay to show yourself compassion when you're going through these journeys, because it's very difficult. And especially, you know, when you are surrounded by a lot of folks who ain't having these conversations, who are not tapping into these deep feelings for a variety of reasons. Like, not saying, for some folks, they don't even feel safe in their body and their environment. So like, this is not about shaming people for trying to avoid these difficult things, because things are difficult. We're like, ouch, I don't want to do that. Like,
and you still got to live life, right?
Listen, it takes a lot of compassion and time and space to willfully go to a painful place. You know, like that takes a lot of courage and a lot of resources and a lot of bravery to just be like, oh yeah, that hurt, but that's fine. I'm gonna keep doing it. You know, like, no, it takes some time. So
is serious, you know, serious work. You know, you literally do like a sabbatical to just be like, you know, let me
listen, and especially when we talk about, like, there was just a bill that did not pass the legislator around bereavement leave for everyone. Right. So this country, we don't even have guaranteed parental leave for folks. So you talking about the type of healing, you know, you're supposed to bury a loved one and they want you back at work in 3 days if you even have that benefit, you know? And I think about, like, I just saw a policy recently that was, you know, talking about bereavement leave. And it's very clear in saying immediate family member, right? And it's like, wait a second, I got cousins that's like,
and this is the cultural sensitivity of it all, right?
Because immediate, we slept in the same bed as kids. Like,
you know, as Black folk, our brother is really like our friend that we grew up with, but you know,
or like, that's my aunt. No, she's not blood related to either of my parents, but that's still my aunt. Exactly. You know, so when we think about those layers too, and just saying folks can't even get access to the space and the time that they need to heal. So and it's not by accident. It's not by accident. And I think about our, like, at least for me being Black American born descendant of enslaved Africans in this land, and thinking about how our folks were experiencing persistent and ongoing grief, whether folks being worked to death and just kind of them trying to do whatever type of grief ritual they were allowed within that small window of time, if any at all, and people being sold away, families being broken up and living with that for a lifetime. We saw when slavery was ended, and that's in air quotes there, we have folks trying to locate their people, putting ads in the paper, like trying to find their people. Could you imagine that, just like living with a lifetime of never seeing these people again?
Some mothers, their children, some husbands, their wives.
Listen, so that's what I'm saying. Like when we talk about generational grief, saying that, that's why I'm huge on saying like we can't avoid our grief and be free, and thinking about how when we tend to our grief now, just the way that also honors our ancestors who never got a chance to take time off, who never got a chance to be sad or show emotion, right? When we can do those things, like there's so much power in that. There's so much power in us being tender with each other, and being a soft place for each other to land, to even just reclaiming our lost rituals. Like there's so much power in that.
Yeah. So the first thing that came to my mind is stop telling people to suck it up and get over it. Because if they need the time and space, they need the time and space. Now that's one side of it. The other side of it is, and I know that even myself, I've said this in the past before I became more in tune with myself, was, I don't even know how to nurture someone who's going through grief. Right. And that's a very real thing because some of us have not processed our own. And so trying to support someone who is processing theirs is virtually impossible.
No, it's a lot. And I just actually just did a Twitter thread on this, about like also some of the things like that I've experienced people saying to me that were incredibly unhelpful. But then also just the idea of like, how do we, nurture each other through our grief, because it can be a lot. And also our grief holding up a mirror to other folks' unprocessed grief.
Yeah.
Right. And so it is okay, I think, for us also to be honest about our limitations and our roles, and just being present for people and be like, hey girl, I don't even know what to say. I'm here. We know people got to eat, like sometimes helping people meet their material needs allows them to focus on their emotional needs.
Correct.
So
that is that right there is, that could be, say it again, right? Even if you don't know how to show up emotionally, can you bring the person some food and make sure they eat? Can you go to their house and light a candle to make it smell good if you know that that's what they like? Can you go and wash clothes for them? Can you
take their recycling bins to the curb because it's trash day? Right. Can you make sure that their kids, or if they're going to school, if they're getting on and off the bus,
take the children out, take them out somewhere if they want to go somewhere, if they haven't been anywhere, take them to the spa, take them to the gym. You may not know what to do in terms of what to say, but oftentimes it's those unspoken things that are done.
And I will say this, sometimes when you're in deep grief, sometimes like I know, like I experience brain fog a lot of the time. So I couldn't always articulate everything I needed. But I also do encourage people to still ask. We say, hey, I don't know if you're able to tell me, but if you can, I'm here. Let me know the things that, because sometimes you don't always know like all the things that are lurking that are not getting done either, So however, sometimes it's okay to ask, but it's also yes, like it's,
and if when you are in someone's life and you know them, their patterns, what they talk about regularly, just show up.
Right. You know your girl make pork chops every Friday, or your girl don't eat pork. Like, these things too. So and listen, you might be the immediate friend or the immediate relative. You can also call in support. You could also reach out to people like, hey, I'm kind of new at this. What should I do? Where should I go? Like sometimes we don't have to also be the lone person to show up. If we are tapped into networks of support too, call in some favors, call in some help.
And never underestimate praying for them, sending them loving energy.
That's true.
Because our ancestors did that too. Even if they were across the, in a whole nother country, they could send them love energetically.
The worst thing we want to do, though, the worst thing we can do is to do nothing. The worst thing we can do is to avoid mentioning people's names, or, oh, I didn't want to say their name. I didn't want to upset you. Excuse me, or avoiding people. Right? Like, I think those are some of the worst things we can do. And I get it also because sometimes, like we said, sometimes their loss will trigger unresolved feelings of loss that some of us have not worked through. But what I'm envisioning, like, oh my gosh, we are all processing our grief and showing up for each other, and so no one person is ever, just burdening this alone. That we are like training up each other of how we need to be there for each other. And this is, again, some of this is, we've had circles of support and care. Like, this is not necessarily anything new, right? We know how to show up and support each other. Grief gets a little tricky because sometimes it's so much, and some of the circumstances can be so devastating that everybody's sad,
Right.
So and sometimes it's like, oh my God, we're all sad, we're all fumbling through this, but we're not alone. This is not a movie.
Sorry, what do you think about like sharing stories about the person or situation in a way that may show, love and adoration for that person or situation?
You mean like in like our friendships or like families, or you mean like publicly?
In the families. So when everybody is grieving, right? They have a story about Nana, and things that she did or said that will bring, just these happy memories to people.
Listen, keep talking about them. Don't they live? There's keep their names in your mouth. Like, that's how we keep their memories alive. That's how we stay connected to them. That's how we for me, that's what helps it feel less like the end. Like, because I'm still connected to my son and who he was and who he is, and just having those conversations, like, still talking about him with his siblings, or, still have his pictures, and still, connected to his friends and things like that. Like, that absolutely, I don't know. Some people feel like it's too painful. For me, it feels painful to be like, that's it. Like, oh, I'm not going to speak my child's name again. I'm not going to have any of his
things. Our tradition. It's also traditional, ancestral. Indigenous people, African people, this is the way that we have always done things, right? To this day, we have whole celebrations, in Central South America, the Day of the Dead, and in Asia, people do the same thing, Day of the Dead or sweep the grave, all of these things. My aunt, my grand aunt, has an entire bedroom in her home dedicated to her mother.
Okay.
Nobody goes in that room. It's her room. Right. And so, as you said, keeping their stories alive, their lessons, it's important to do that. It's so important. A friend of mine who has a child who passed away. She has another child, and she talks to her child about her older brother that passed away. You know what I'm saying? Even though she never met him, she came along many years after, but still, it's in you. It's a part of you. This person is a part of you, and they're, in the ancestral realm in some way, guiding, helping, assisting you now. And so that may help some people with grief, so this is an amazing conversation. so many things were said here. But one of the things that made me think about, and we can go into so many different avenues, but it really just made me think about how living life intentionally and powerfully is so important, and how this conversation of grief and men and emotions and men came up several times this past week. I don't know if you work with men and if you've seen a difference in the way that men function, but if you could briefly talk about that before we get into the Black mermaids and what that is and how we connect with that.
So it's interesting because I think the work that I do, I mean, it has been less attended by masculine identified folks. And I think there's a couple things I want to say about this. I think there is absolutely a social conditioning that happens that tries to get Black folks from avoiding their feelings, period. And then I think there's obviously this other conditioning that happens that tries to not, I think, have Black men also be clued into their emotional well-being. And so the problem with that, obviously, right? There are these discussions about, a lot of times, we're in this, I just typed these words last night, like we're in this, this emotional versus logic binary hell. And a lot of times this conversation is centered around somehow masculine identified men folk are supposed to be more logical. And so, there's so many myths that persist around a lot of things. And I also the really difficult or the really tragic way in which also anything that kind of how emotional becomes a word that is supposed to be a catch-all for kind of a certain sadness or a certain type of outpouring of a certain type of emotion.
And it's seen as a weakness as well.
Right. And so emotions, there's so many emotions, but there's always collapse
on the one.
Right.
It's like you can't make decisions. You're not clear. You don't have the ability to lead or do this and that and that and this if you are emotional. And unfortunately, that gets attached to women. And
it's so unfortunate, because I think the part that we always seem to miss about having emotions, and one, there's so many of them, there's so many emotions, and it just becomes like, oh, you're emotional. The problem that I think it also is that our emotions are there to also show us things. Exactly. And I think when we ignore that, and when we also don't embody them, and then just like want to defer to logic, it's a very dangerous way to live. But what I've also found too from some folks is they told me, and this is not come from just men or masculine folks. I've also had people say, Julia, it was more acceptable for me to be angry than it was for me to be sad. And so I think about that too, about how the expectation around what type of emotions it's okay for anyone to show. So the thing with men, and also have talked to some other child loss survivors, and one of the things that they said, that they also feel like men were also excluded from those conversations, that it was just most of the focus was given to the mother, that the man was kind of supposed to be the strong one and just kind of go on.
I can
to kind of be the backbone. And so my concern with this is just that if we're not, and I'm not saying that it's anyone else's responsibility to create these conditions except for men themselves and masculine folks. I'm not saying that, that like everybody has to put themselves in a position. It's like, what is the balance? Like, I have to, even as a Black American grieving woman, like I had to give myself that permission, right? Like I came to that conclusion very early on, that when I get to a place where people are no longer comfortable with it, my grief is still going to be here.
Right.
That ain't up for them to decide. They
Mhm.
don't get to have that say about how I process my emotions and how I live my life around grief. Especially from folks who are not even doing similar healing work.
Right.
Right. So I'm saying that to say that we all have to get to a place where we say, hey, I don't need your permission to live this way. I don't need your permission to be able to tap into the essence of who I am.
And seek out your tribe. Yeah, seek out your tribe, because this is something that in maternal mental health, right? So, you know, when we're talking about maternal mental health, a lot of it, unfortunately, is not taken seriously because it's just seen as women being overly emotional because of hormones.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of it is that oftentimes, and unfortunately, I've heard this in trainings where the conversation around fathers and incorporating fathers was centered around what the woman should do to ensure that the man is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the woman may have some more information. However, the reality is that she's not only dealing with the societal, the physiological, the emotional of having a baby. Yes, the man receives some of it. And how can we discuss with men that this is what you can possibly expect from both your mate and for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you could do to help yourself move through it. And it is important because, right? So it's also sensitizing and having these conversations differently with everyone, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's the whole point. It's with everyone. I think that's part of the problem, is that everything, like, because even like some folks are never going to know how to show up for us a certain type of way because they don't show up for themselves in that same way.
Exactly.
Right. So I don't know how much you're going to be able to nurture and support me and encourage me through a process that you yourself are not experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like if you are closing off that part of you, and then here I come alone and hold up a mirror to that part of you, like everybody's not going to want to look in that mirror. You're not going to be, you know, on in that moment, just be like, oh yes, I'm brave enough to do this work alongside of you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, especially not when that person is asking you to censor their emotions or their feelings in that moment. Like it may not even be the best time for you to be like, oh, it's my time to also do this work. I don't know. But I do know that none of us will be able, I think, to tap into the full potential of who we are if that is a part that we are consistently closing off. And I think that even there are some very culturally specific things that, like, over the last couple of years, you know, when we talk about purposefully avoiding our feelings, when we say to people like, oh, you know, get about your bag, you know, and get into a bag, or get about your feelings and get into a bag, like also kind of linking this idea of avoidance with some certain type of prosperity. So for a lot of people, especially I think when if we are still holding on to these ideas of around a certain type of traditional patriarchy that says that men are supposed to be the providers and the protectors as well, then the last thing that we're really asking men to do is to really tap into a part of them supposedly, and we want them to avoid that side because we don't want them to be in their feelings because they have other things that they need to go out here to do to supposedly provide and protect. And so it's a thing that, and let me say this, because one of my one of my creator friends, she says that, you know, we need to reclaim our Black ass emotions.
That need to be a t-shirt.
For real, it does. And I feel like I quote Eris Smallwood every time I do these interviews, because I think it is such a powerful statement, because I do not want to pretend that Black folks just woke up one day, of all genders, Black folks of all genders woke up one day and was like, yes, I want to be strong, stoic, and emotionally avoidant and carry the burdens of the world. We didn't wake up and say that. That is the conditions in which, you know, we have been displaced and kidnapped and all those things, like, as a result of that. So being able to not crumble under the circumstances of white supremacy, it's a lot. it's a lot, right? And also trying to give the appearance of being not affected by these things, not reminding other people of the things all the time that they rather not, engage with in the interest of moving on,
And
right?
sometimes doing that in a way that keeps you in a perpetual cycle of moving. So just yesterday, I was listening to a conversation about Black women, um, doing things. What do we do to live well? And the conversation was basically, the woman was saying that a lot of us, we see all this Black girl luxury websites or TikToks or whatever
Mhm.
popping up with Black women doing luxurious things. That's great. But what can you do to actually improve your quality of life? And a lot of it's centered around, and I'm so happy that this guy, because I've been having these conversations for so long. Your self-care is about more about what you remove out of your life, these various expectations that people put on you, these false beliefs, these trying to stay strong all the time. It's more about what you remove and how you buy back your time and your mental space.
Yes, and let me say this, I don't want to. Oh, the self-care conversation is that's a whole nother conversation.
It is.
Um,
It really is.
but I think, because I think, I'm always, for me, when I hear self-care, I always only think of Audre Lorde, who said, caring for myself is not a self-indulgence, right? That it is an act of political warfare.
It
Like,
is.
so when I hear self-care, I'm always thinking about that, those words penned from self-described Black poet, warrior, lesbian, writer, poet who was fighting for her life, after a multiple cancer diagnosis, and was saying, I want to survive, right? I want to live. I'm trying to put myself in these certain conditions so that I can get well.
Right.
Right. And so at a time, right, when we're talking about the muling of Black folks, the muling of Black women, and how we're supposed to just, care for everyone else and put ourselves last. So I think when we talk about self-care, is kind of also being representing an act of refusal, right? Like, no, I'm not going to show up and save everybody else. I must be the person that I save. Right. And so when we kind of start getting into like, oh, self-care and community care and all those other things. And it's like, that's cool, y'all. But at the end of the day, communities are a bunch of selves trying to come together.
Exactly.
And so if people in the community are not well, if people in the community don't feel like they have time to stop and tend to themselves, right? If you can't reflect that behavior back to someone else, all of these other things are like, they don't mean as much. So when we talk about self-care,
Yes, you just put that into so beautifully, because I had that conversation with people before, because I, again, been talking about self-care forever. And my personal definition is the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical care and attention that you give to yourself. Right?
yes, and then people were like, oh, well, a bubble bath, a bubble bath.
I mean, that's cool if when you sitting in that bubble bath, you actually thinking about some things and
But I think
muting some things. That's cool.
I guess for me, I'm just like, yeah, like a Black woman getting a manicure, a Black woman taking a bubble bath, right? To being able to say, like, no, I'm not doing these other 5 things that y'all want me to do. Like, that's okay. Like, that's important. So I think sometimes what I'm also finding, there's a lot of language that comes from very specific places. And when we generalize it, we use the specificity and it loses its power. So that's why I also sometimes, like, when we kind of get into these battles with each other about self-caring this and self-care should be this and it should be community care. And it's like, okay, I get it. And I'm also like, I'm trying to stop also getting attached to saying, like, definitions and meanings could also evolve for different people depending on the context, right? It doesn't have to just only be that one way for forever. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the specific place, maybe where some of those origins came from, because it might already be doing a thing that you're trying to recreate. Like it might have already been doing that, but you got that definition from somebody else as opposed to the originator. And so now you thought something got missed, as opposed to no, it just got ignored. So, but I don't want to lose sight about the conversation around emotionality and grief and Black men, Black masculine identified folks, because I think that I would love to have a workshop where there were way more Black men than there were other folks. I would love to be able to say that this work is reaching them, and also understanding these societal conditions that still make softness in a lot of us, like, makes us a target, makes us feel less safe.
Yeah.
Right? We have these conversations now in mass about being vulnerable and all of that. Yeah, vulnerability is cool, but please make sure that you are in the care of people who can see it for your vulnerability. Like vulnerability is not you throwing yourself to wolves. Like that is not vulnerability. Like there are certain conditions to which I want to be vulnerable under. And so if those conditions don't exist, then I want to create them, or I want to find people for which I can create them with. So that is always my, like, with Black folks, Black men, like, if you feel like you can't be that way, then please create those conditions so that you can be that way. Please find the folks for which you can be that with, right? Because to just not have a lifetime of it just because you felt like, oh, there wasn't the place. Like we make the places, right? We make the places. And I think also people always, like with Black women, it's like, listen, the world ain't hand us no place. The world ain't hand us no space. Like we show up and we make those places. We get with folks who, because it's not like, oh, every Black woman wants to have this conversation with me about grief. Like that is not, like, no, that is not the case, and I think about Audre Lorde again, who said that, there, in Sister Outsider, she says that, there are some folks who think she's too soft, right? And let me see if I can even find the direct quote, because I just think there is something so powerful in what she said about softness, because she said, most of the Black women I know think I cry too much or that I'm too public about it. I've been told that crying makes me seem soft and therefore of little consequence, as if our softness has to be the price we pay out for our power rather than simply the one that's paid most easily and most often. And that is from Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred and Anger. And so that doesn't, like, not everyone is on this softness, vulnerability, agenda. But then what do we do? Like, what's our responsibility to ourselves and each other? Like, what I try to do is I try to create the spaces that I wanted to see. Right. I don't want to be just come a hardened shell of myself. And so I try to create those spaces of what I wanted to see in the world, and then invite other folks along, and then hope that they invite other folks along. So that's always my advice to folks. It takes a lot of courage, yes, to be like, I'm creating the space that I want to see. And then bring the folks along that you think, that you trust, that you think can reflect back to you that same type of love and care and tenderness that you are showing. I don't want this world to turn me into a shell of myself.
Right.
I do not want to give up my power in that way. And I think is when she's talking about this idea of power, like that's the part that like breaks my heart, because I think that we talk about a certain type of some of the behavior that is destructive, that is not putting us in a better place, that is not leaving us better off. but is way more commonly accepted. And I'm not against anger, because anger absolutely has its uses. I'm definitely not a person, like, I believe in love and light, and sometimes lighting some shit on fire. So I'm
Good.
not I'm
Love
not
that.
against I'm not against anger at all. I'm saying, let us have I want to be able to use all my emotions, okay, child? Like, I want to be able to be like, oh, this requires my anger. Let me give it anger. But if it
Exactly.
requires my sadness, I don't want to give it anger. If it requires my tenderness, I don't want to give it anger. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like,
And be
no.
in tune enough with yourself that
Yes.
you know what it is
Yes.
that is required in that moment.
That's what I'm trying to say to us. Like, feel your grief so you can feel some other shit. Feel your grief so that you know when it's grief. Feel your grief so you know when it's something else. Like, feel your grief so that it is not just drowning out and collapsing all of your other emotions.
And
Right?
sometimes we need to find the words for our emotions. There's this great,
Mhm.
if you Google, wheel of emotions, you'll
Yes, yes.
find
I
a
love the will of
few
emotion.
that will have like, the basic words that we use, like sad, happy, and it'll give
Right,
you.
right, right. That is all those other ones.
So Google that, because that's again something that I do with my coaching clients. Like, let's name this for real, for real. What is this? You know
Yes.
what I'm saying? What are you actually feeling here? What is really trying to come through you, so that you can now know, one, how it feels when it comes through again, and two, how to sort of find what to do with it, how to soothe it, how to express it, how to whatever it is that you need to do with it to transmute it. Because I just read something the other day where a therapist was talking about how our bodies are not meant to hold all of these emotions. Our conscious and subconscious mind is not meant for that.
Not at all.
So, we are meant to transmute it and release it so that we can have space, to allow, our limitlessness to come through. When we're holding all of that in, we're literally functioning off of, air and fumes, not off of
Listen,
divineness. You know what I'm
that's why
saying? Like,
when in Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison, one of the characters, they're saying, if you want to fly, you got to give up some of the shit that weighs you down.
exactly.
When I think about Erica Badu's song Bag Lady, you can't hurry up because you got too much stuff. Right.
Exactly.
And so a lot of us, we got these, some of us, some of our baggage is, packed in Louis Vuitton, cases. Some of us got trash bags. Some of us, the bag is just, leaving a trail of mess behind it. And so it's like, how do we give up some of these things, right? And I think, I know we like to talk about like how some people also don't want to heal because they want to keep telling those same stories, or um but also, do we really understand, like, again, those stories are completely embedded in people's lives, like it's embedded in their whole being. So the excavation part, right, of carving those things out and get into the heart of it, um like that's some work,
Yeah.
like that's some work. And so if people haven't felt safe or haven't created the conditions to which they feel like they can do those things or do that work, it's going to be very difficult. It's not impossible, though. It's not impossible. um it's just difficult, right? But then so is walking around with, life is hard. I always say that, like, we gonna have to choose our hard,
Right.
because ain't none of this easy. Like, none of this is easy. So I it's not easy.
No.
That's
It's not easy, but
so
it's absolutely necessary. Before we jump
right.
into, because we talking, okay. I love it. I love the conversation because this is my kind of conversation. I did want to just talk about someone who I follow on social media who does work with men around processing emotions, because he's done his own work as well.
Mhm.
But his name is Jason Wilson, and he wrote a book called Cry Like a Man. I have not
Okay.
read the book, but I definitely recommend it to people often, and I'm going to start giving it as gifts to men. And he's connected with Charlemagne the God. And I always look at him and his transformation, because he has really transformed, and in the public eye, significantly. Have you ever, like, well, back in the day when I used to listen to the radio and he was on with Wendy Williams, he was a mess. It was terrible. Okay. Now he really speaks to men about transforming themselves and just being different. Like, you don't have to be, this aggressive, doing this and type of thing. Like, you can express yourself authentically and be supported. And I think
You know,
that's
he's not someone that I follow.
right. I don't necessarily follow him, but being in the mental health space, I have seen some of the work that he has done and is doing in that space. And so, I think that finding those things, because I know for myself, when I needed the support, sometimes I had to find it in people who looked like me in order to get it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I had never seen a wealthy, plus size Black woman. And I was like, well, is that, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes you question whether or not something is possible because you don't see people who look like you in a
No,
space.
absolutely. I think we all have to find our own examples of folks that, can illustrate that for us. Agreed. Absolutely.
Exactly. So, finding those people, finding that, because it is possible, anything is possible. So before we, so to continue the conversation around, before we wrap up, I wanted you to talk about your brand, Black Mermaids, and what it is, what it means, how people can connect with you and, gather your book. Um, you know, yeah, I really want to talk about that because I love it, and what it represents.
Yeah, so this is actually the 5th anniversary. 5 years ago, my
Today?
first, this week. 5 years ago this week. Yeah, 5 years ago this week, my first collection of poetry, Black Mermaids, was published. The title coming from a reimagining around mermaids. Like, what if our enslaved ancestors, the ones that jumped overboard or were thrown overboard, when they hit the water, they in turn became mermaids. And so that story came to me. I was on vacation in Puerto Rico in 2013, and that story wouldn't leave me. I thought I was going to write a travel essay about my experience there, but it actually turned out I ended up writing this poem. And then, had went through a bit of a struggle in trying to publish the collection, and then eventually the collection came. And I just, as a poet who had been poeting for like over 2 decades, I was like, it's time for me to have a book out in the world. And when when the book was released, it was like a portal opened. Like, that was essentially all I was trying to do, was just publish this collection. And then it just kind of, like, I like the joke, it just kind of grew a fin and swam away. And I've been kind of riding the wave ever since. Basically, the book really just transformed, I think, my relationship to the possibility of the written word, and also just being connected to people. So the book came out in November 2016. Then I was like, oh my goodness, because people were really responding to the book. And a lot of times, people still associate mermaids kind of like with childhood. So people were like, oh, is this like a children's book? Or, will my 10-year-old like this book? And I'm like, oh, your 10-year-old could absolutely probably read it, but it's not really like a book for kids. It's, and so I was like, oh my gosh, I have to put something else out in the world, because people are really checking for this idea, this concept of Black mermaids. And so I talked to my homegirl, and she was like, girl, I think you should just write a children's book. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, why did I never think of that? As somebody who absolutely loves children's books, like, my whole life, I've been a voracious reader. And I was like, I'm gonna write this book. So I sat down and I wrote Karima and the Black Mermaids. It was originally called, it had a different title, but I gave it to my daughter, I think it was like 15 at the time, to read. And she was like, oh my gosh, mom, this is really good. It's like a real writer wrote it. And I was like, oh, okay, my introverted Libra child, like, giving me a compliment, I'll take it. And so I just was moving forward with, the person who illustrated the cover for me of the collection of poetry. I hit her up and was like, hey girl, I just wrote a children's book. Do you want to illustrate it? And she was like, well, I've literally never done anything like that before, but if you trust me, I'm like, listen, you can draw, you can paint. Like, what else do you need to be able to do? Like, that's it right there. She was like, well, let's do it. So we worked through the process. And in April 2017, I had my first pop-up shop. Like, I had my one book, and one t-shirt design that I came up with. And it was a really good day. And then, a few months later, my life radically changed with the death of my oldest son, Julian. And initially, I wasn't really thinking, like, it was just like, none of this means anything to me. None of this makes any sense. Like, everything can go to hell, including the children's book. Like, I'm fine. Like, let's move on. But it didn't take me long to realize that, like, creativity would also still very much be a source of healing for me, alongside additional healing work. I always try to make that distinction, because I think sometimes people think that creatives like create their best work from their wound. And it's like, yeah, but the healing work is what keeps the wound from ultimately consuming us. The healing work is what keeps us from becoming consumed when the work is no longer there to distract us or give us something to focus on. So I had packaged the children's book and all of that, and just was like, I'm not really feeling this, put this out in the world. One of my closest creative friends, Cody Burt, said, well, Julia, are you just gonna bake the cake and I put the icing on it? And I was like, you're right. So we're gonna put this book out in the world. Karima and the Black Mermaids came out in August 2017. And so ultimately, I have just been, Black Mermaids has become like a creative container for me. It's where I get to, make my ideas and my dreams happen and put my work out into the world, without having to rely heavily on, traditional publishing, which is like, can be very slow and very myopic and all those things. And I'm just a person that's like, look, these stories came to me for a reason. Some of the stuff is a divine download. I'm not giving anyone power over that. And so Black Mermaids is the space where I get to do all of that. And I believe in 2022, I'm going to start like selling some of my original artwork on the platform as well. So Black Mermaids has it has given me the opportunity to just continuously expand my world, and my vision for how to exist in the world. So I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share Black Mermaids with others.
Black Mermaid sounds like a great publishing company for other Black women creatives and men creatives who are doing similar work. Just saying. I'm just saying.
It's definitely a goal of mine or a dream. I haven't broken it down to the goal yet, but it's definitely something that I envision, like wanting to share the platform with other folks and just support, other people in the journey, because I know that it can be a lot. It can be a lot. And we don't want, we want to leave this space empty, right? I don't want folks talking about they've been wanting to publish a book for 20 years. Like, no, like let's publish it. Like, free that thing so you can get on with the other parts of your life.
Yep, I totally hear you and agree. Trust me, I've been in the process of just creating and putting out, but I love this idea of or the idea of Black Mermaids and the transmutation of this idea of, people who may have jumped the ships, transforming, because it really connects back to our creation stories as well of, Mami Wata, and, that idea of, just, I'll just say that's what it reminded me of the first time I heard it. I was like, oh, this is a Mami Wata type, and bringing that essence back into our fold, because before there was that idea of the romantic mermaids or whatever. It was, we have that creation story of, the mermaids that were in the water coming to land, and transforming into humans and helping whoever was here and all of this other stuff. But anyway, learn the story. It's a great creation story of how the African woman came into being. And so with that, this conversation was so powerful. We went over our hour, child. So over it, but I'm glad that we did, because so many great things were touched upon about grief and being able to move through that as a mom, just a person supporting a mom, men. We didn't touch on children and children, going through grief, because they experience it in some way, shape, or form as well.
Absolutely.
And so that's another level to consider. I really appreciate your creativity. I appreciate your ability to, you coming on and sharing your story and being open and vulnerable with that, so that it can assist others in living their most powerful lives, their most authentic lives, with all of their range of emotions and all of their the realities, being able to express themselves through their lens and have the expectation of being supported, right? Not having to be someone else to get support, or worse yet, not even thinking that they can or should receive
They deserve it.
That's even worse in my opinion. And so, on this podcast, Mommy Matters, we try to discuss intricacies, depths of conversations. We hear a lot of surface things, but I really want us to hear things that are under the surface, because I feel like that's where we really transform. Those are the conversations where we really get to see ourselves and the intricacies of who we are and how we function and operate and how we can liberate ourselves. And so thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate you. If you had any last words that you could share with our community, what would you share? What advice would you give? Or
Well, Cecile, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great honor and pleasure to talk with you. I think the last words that I would like to leave, because you mentioned children, and that we didn't talk a whole lot about children, and especially around grief. But one of the things I have found is that when we show our children that we are the complex human beings, I think we in turn give them a model of which they can also exist in the world. So if we show our children that, like, yes, it's okay to be sad, or it's okay to experience joy, or it's okay to express grief, I think our children also then grow up and have real examples of how they can in turn do the same. I know we like to think that it's like, oh, we should cry in the shower only, or we should, hide our tears or hide the difficulties that we're having. And I know there's absolutely a balance when it comes to certain things, especially that, our children did not cause. We don't want to just, show them all the painful parts, because they're, but I think when it comes to our emotionality and being connected to their feelings, I think that is something that we can only model for them. And then also giving them the opportunity to express those feelings. So that would be the last thing I would want to end with.
Yes, and that is a powerful end. And thank you all for listening. Please, connect with Julia, support her work, where you can find on juliamallory.com or blackmermaids.com, and connect with her on social outlets at Julia Mallory, on Instagram and on Facebook.
The Julia Mallory.
The Julia Mallory on
Instagram.
So yeah, please connect with her and reach out to her. And thank you so much for listening. Peace and love. Hi guys, Cecile Edwards here of the Mommy Matters podcast. I have to tell you, if you have not heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And Anchor will distribute your podcast for you. So it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. Did I tell you that you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership? It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download your Anchor app or go to Anchor FM, anchor.fm to get started. You will not be dissatisfied. Did you like that? I know it was as informative for you as it was for me. Look, this is a process for all of us. And to keep this process going, I would love to invite you to donate to our podcast. We want to continue to give you high-level content, beautiful content that enlightens and inspires and broadens your vision to elevate you and evolve. So please feel free to go to the podcast page at anchor.fm/Mommy Matters. We would love to hear your questions and comments as well, so that we can discuss them in future podcasts. And you can email that to momevolve@gmail.com. You can also visit the website and send your comments there. www.mommyevolve.com. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Peace and love.